Good evening and welcome to our This is America discussion. I would like to welcome everyone that is viewing us on Facebook and YouTube. You are welcomed and we are delighted to have you here with us today. If we could all bow our heads so that I can open up with the word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for giving us the opportunity to be here today and for allowing us to be your light within our community. I ask that you guide this discussion and grant each of our panelists with knowledge and insight. In your name I pray, amen. Okay, first I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Again, my name is Janae Lomas and I will be your facilitator this evening. I am first going to introduce who is viewing with us live, Rudy. Rudy is an assistant professor of history at Broward College, South Campus, where he teaches American history and African American history. Jean Bart was the 2015 to 2016 Broward College South Campus Professor of the Year. He is the founder and CEO of Rudy Jean Bart, Inc., which affords him the opportunity to do motivational speeches as well as presentations discussing education, entrepreneurship, history, and race. In May of 2018, Professor Jean Bart became a TEDx speaker as he spoke on the subject, The Sway Science That Can Kill My Son. In 2019, he was awarded the Gates Corporation Endowed Teaching Chair. Next, I would like to introduce Pastor Earl Meadows, ordained Seventh-day Adventist pastor who is now retired. Pastor Meadows, here to my left, is the CEO and founder of Men Under Development, MUD Inc., a culturally competent male development, violence, abandonment, and pretrial program. He also serves as a family consultant for the 11th District Court for Domestic Violence of Miami. He is a licensed vendor and group facilitator for NYC Board of Education, Chicago Public Schools, Broward and Miami-Dade schools with 30-plus years of experience. His men are not born, men are made. There is a difference between being a man, manhood, and maleness. Next, I would like to introduce Endell Brown. Endell Brown is an attorney and a member in good standing of the Florida Bar and is admitted in the Southern, Middle, and Northern District Courts of the United States, federal court in Florida. Attorney Brown has been recognized as top 40 under 40 leaders by Legacy Magazine as published in the Miami Herald. He has provided legal analysis in numerous televised appearances on ABC, CNN, HLN, and MSNBC. He currently serves as a trial analyst of the Internationally Distributed Law and Crime Network. Next, I'm going to introduce Adria Lee. Adria Lee Perrin has been a South Florida educator for 15 years and is an avid champion for youth. He is currently a site director for a Miami-Dade County public school as part of the 5,000 Role Model Initiative initiated by Congresswoman Frederica Wilson. Adria Lee is an advocate for social injustice in the Black community. He is currently working on a social collective to promote the economic and social advancement of the Black community. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here with us today. First, we're going to start off if any one of you can answer or explain to us what police brutality is. And I'm going to open the floor.
I'll jump in there. Police brutality can have a number of different manifestations. It's typically defined as an excessive use of force. Police brutality also manifests itself in threats or intimidation, or at times deprivation of rights or medical assistance in certain situations. But we see it play out many times where an officer in our opinion or the opinion of others, uses force that is more than the situation warrants, or uses force against someone that is not resisting or is not involved in any type of criminal activity. And that's typically what we're referring to when we talk about police brutality.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add to that?
When I consider and conducted the research on police brutality, I looked at the definition less and more at the history. And one of the things I concluded kind of goes back in my mind of a statement I made some time ago. When culture as a practice becomes culture as a preference, then culture is prejudice. And there is a culture of brutality in the historicity of police force. And I use that term because the historicity is in the term itself. When white America realized that black America had a copyright on nigger, white America realized that Ice-T and Ice Cube had a trademark on nigger, then we began a campaign. Because in the back of my mind, what began to happen is a question that Danny Davis asked. What's in a name? And I started looking, considering the term police force. And in that name is a culture of brutality. It goes back some 84 years when the first police force began. It was in North and South Carolina where the night watch became the constables and the constables became the police force. And the reason why the term was used because it was caught up in brutality. The job description required brutality. It was for the maintenance of the slave market. It was for capturing those runaway slaves, for punishing them, for keeping and bringing them to market in a way that behavior allowed them to be controlled. So it is caught up in the term force. So when we speak about reform, we need to consider the name. What's in the name? What's in the terminology? Police force. Well, brutality is in the history.
So, and then can you answer this question for me? Is police brutality always radically motivated, racially motivated?
I cannot speak outside of my experience. Mm-hmm. And inside of my experience, I see and I understand that as a people, as a person that is a man that is black in America, America has an expectation that these ethics will control police brutality. But America has gotten away from principle and enforcing principles, so therefore, the ethics, they adjust, they change whenever the culture changes. So when we speak about the abuse, it's consistent and it's racially motivated because slavery finds its seed in the very description of the black man, the Negro at that time, the colored man of that time. So the idea, the concept of control and the relationship between force, not power, not authority, but the relationship between force, police force, and interacting with the black male, it seems to always produce, another statement, independence irritates insecurity. And you'll find that black men generally are secure, and we irritate insecurity. But then you couple that with the history, what was bred in the culture. Yes, it's not only racially motivated, but it's defined by racial confrontation.
Would you like to add to that, Adrian?
I think the current state that we're facing right now, and I must agree with you. My perspective is since the police everyone, it's very difficult to say that it's racially motivated on paper, that is. But we look at the facts. We're looking at the facts of what's happening in our society, and we look at the idea that 24% of the kills on persons that were taken into custody by police are black. And we find that there's also a truth that we're only about 13% of the population. So when you look at it with those statistics, you have to ask yourself those questions. Is there something special about our race as to why we are dying more than every other race, and those statistics are only for deaths. When we consider how many people didn't die but fell victim to the brutality, you really have to ask yourself those questions. You mentioned something, Pastor Meadows, and we can go where you were and even further back into the Carolinas, where the policing actually began, even into the 1700s. The purpose of the police were essentially to just maintain that slave labor, make sure that we're not, running away, making sure that their investments are secure. So, like you were saying, and I completely agree with you, how deeply rooted the idea of the police force by the name is just kind of ingrained into that name. And why would we think it'd be anything different if we're still using the police force and finding these statistics to be true?
Yeah, and accurately so, 1704. And what's unique about that date, 1704, it's 84 years after 1620. 1620, the Mayflower Compact, where these pilgrims, they called pilgrims because they were on a pilgrimage, where they left England, where there was persecution, and they said, we're leaving England and we're coming to New England, and they were called Puritans, religious purists, and they were the founding fathers. The foundation of what the Constitution would become was built upon the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact is built upon two principles: civil liberty and religious liberty. And this is why I always say that I wish we can at least have that discussion with other folk to at least establish the fact that social justice is specific to civil liberty. But you don't hear that argument, you don't hear that presentation. We always hear the detachment. They're not connected when they should be connected, because if you're fighting this fight and it's in America, then you ought to realize that you have firm ground to stand on. And going back to 1620, 84 years before 1706, these religious purists said, we're not going to have slaves. We're going to have religious liberty. We're going to have civil liberty. And then in 1704, we have a police force.
Okay, so the next question I'm going to direct to Rudy, who is joining us. Once again, he's joining us via Zoom. So this question again is for Rudy. Can you give us a bit of historical context for why this issue is significant beyond unwarranted injury and or the tragic loss of life? So in other words, how deeply rooted in our past is this problem?
So I think for me, one of the things that really has to be taken into consideration, and first of all, it's my honor to be amongst a panel of just wonderful, powerful black men. I think for me, when I look at this aspect, right, of essentially authority, there is this aspect of authority that exists, right? And it's an aspect of authority that existed in the plantation system in order to generate massive capital, right? Everything that we think about as it relates to slavery is all about how do you maintain this capital structure of America, specifically more so white America, right? And so that speaks to the aspect of catching slaves, because the thought is you are catching and returning property, right? The notion of you deciding to go and run away suggests some sense of criminality in the mindset and the eyes of white folk. Therefore, your capture is deemed not only necessary, but is deemed as some sort of justice in order to return to the master what was rightfully his, right? When you take a look into that aspect beyond slavery, though, beyond just the aspect of police brutality, one must have a serious dialogue and conversation about mass incarceration and about the fact that what you had in Alabama in the 1850s was that the jail was composed of 99% white individuals. But then in the 1870s in Alabama, jails were composed of 75% of black folk, right? Because the thought was that now that slavery is over, and therefore the value of black folk is no longer there and it ceased to exist, right? That value of creating labor. The thought is now, how do we do away with them? Abraham Lincoln, it should be stated, is not someone who is this hero that we all paint him out to be, but he is someone who actually thought that one effective way of ending slavery was to therefore pay the slaves and then, or pay the slave masters, right, and then deport all the slaves and all the black people out of America. So the reality is we're not wanted in America historically. So when we take a look into that and then we have this sort of consideration of what it means to be property, when you now introduce police officers, notice the aspect of violence is the thought of exertion of authority. You are not a human being, you are subhuman, you are 3/5, and therefore you are property, and you're not wanted here. You're especially not wanted in white spaces. So when we take into consideration the fact that the government and banks and various things made sure to engineer segregation, that it is not some mere de jure segregation that took place, but instead is actually a kind of segregation that ends up taking place where that is intentional and purposeful. That exertion of violence on black bodies is an articulation of white America, of them not wanting us here. This is the reason why there's disproportionality when it comes to police killing us. This is the reason why there is disproportionality when it comes to our incarceration. Last example that I give to you all, again, framing it not just in police brutality aspect, but a whole carceral system. There is something called convict lease system. And in the convict lease system, it's a situation in which if you are deemed the property of the state by being a prisoner, the state therefore could sell you to somebody else to work for them, oftentimes coal miners and the like. If you notice people in orange jumpsuits working on the side of the road, that's while they're incarcerated, right? That's them working for the state for free. All of this is an extra articulation of slavery. And why is that legal? Because in the 13th Amendment, there is a caveat. Yes, slavery is over, except, right, if you are therefore a criminal, that slavery is indeed justified. And so the liberation of black people is not something that police are interested in. They're more so interested in the incarceration of black people, because really people are interested in the extinction of black people. So what you're witnessing in violence from police to George Floyd is not just an extinction in the micro, but it speaks to the extinction in the macro of the fact that black people were never wanted in America after slavery was over.
Thank you. And Del, would you also add to that question for me?
Sure. I mean, and by the way, I'm getting a wonderful history lesson from this illuminated panel y'all got here. But when we think about policing in America and the intersection between policing and color, as Pastor brought up, there were the slave codes and those that were deputized. And then we just saw in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, where a young man is jogging and two civilians take it upon themselves to get guns and go hop in a truck, and another guy, and they chase this guy down as if they have some type of authority. Think back to that happening on a much larger scale in the 1700s. If they believed that there was a slave that was acting up, or if there were, you were holding slaves in your house, it didn't matter whether you were white or black. If they thought slaves were in your house, that slave patrol had the right to go into your home and search for slaves. And add that to the fact that the people who saw people of color as people, they were the criminals. They were the ones breaking the law by saying, we're going to have compassion for our fellow man. And then you move forward from the time of the slave patrol as there, is the so-called Emancipation Proclamation and other things. Now, the police forces that move from the slave patrol, you can't call it the slave patrol anymore. Now you have a police force that are largely tasked with keeping the underclass in control. And that underclass is comprised of black people, African Americans, immigrants, the poor, et cetera, et cetera. The police force was more concerned with controlling people, making sure they didn't act up, making sure they did not threaten the economics of the system. Now you fast forward to today, and you see on the side of a police car, protect and serve, right? But when you grow up in the neighborhoods that we grow up in, it doesn't seem like they're serving you or protecting you very much. To many people, it seems as if they're actually being controlled and corralled and making sure they don't get out of line or they don't interfere with the business of other people. When we have the situation that we have now, where we have a president that considers himself a law and order president, and he says as he's stumping for the election, you know, if you're taking a guy into custody, you're getting him into the car, don't be too gentle. It's okay if you're a little rough, you know, I'm paraphrasing, they hit their head or whatever the case may be. And then when the people of this nation, along with other people around the world, stand up and say what we saw in the instance of George Floyd, along with all the other issues that we have faced as a country, we cannot have that. Enough is enough, and we're going to stand up. His response, the President of the United States' response, is to tell the governors that you're not being tough enough. You have to dominate these people. So the response is not how do we deal with our citizens. The response is more force. So that is part of the history that we're dealing with. We're dealing with the history of force, and we're dealing with the history of race. And then we're also dealing with the issue of class. Because when they had the people that didn't want to work, that they had large-scale strikes, they used the police force against those working-class white people as well. And so we have to look at all of the different factors that factor into policing in America: class, race, money, and force.
Thank you. So for Rudy, being that it's deeply rooted in the history of us Americans, how do we, or is it possible to prevent history from repeating itself?
So I think one of the things that we have to take into consideration is something that Malcolm X taught, who I named my son after Malcolm, so that lets you know how I feel about him. And shortly when a friend of his and other brothers were killed by LA police officers in 1962, he asked the famous question, who taught you to hate yourself, right? Who taught you to hate the skin that you're in? And I think that as Black people, what we need to recognize and think about is that we often point to Tulsa, Oklahoma, right, and Black Wall Street and its bombing in 1921, or the fact that Rosewood also was burned down to the ground and represented, again, Black people independent and being for oneself. But I think that we've allowed that to be somewhat of a deterrent in that we haven't collectively try to do that more frequently, right? We need to be dedicated to Black people. If we as Black people, individually and collectively, were in love with Black people and stop trying to act as though that is not what is needed and necessary, then I think we can maybe start to see some aspects of change. We as Black people cannot control the behavior of white people. That is impossible, right? What we can control is the behavior of ourselves, right? And we must begin to value ourselves more. We must be educated on our own history, in our own ways, in our own culture. We must believe in a Pan-Africanism, right? Which means no longer am I focused exclusively on my Haitianness, or someone is focused on their Jamaicanness or African-Americanness, but we are first African people first. We are Black first. Because when the police stop you, they don't ask you when they stop you, before I beat you down, are you of Haitian descent? Are you African American? Abner Louima was Haitian in NYPD. Amadou Diallo was shot 41 times and he was African. Sean Bell, African American, and the list goes on and on and on. So what does that look like in order to kind of curtail history and kind of switch it, right? It means, number one, that we practice what Malcolm X preached in his speech called the Ballot or the Bullet, that is Black nationalism in the aspect of economics. Be extremely intentional in putting your dollars in Black businesses. For every dollar that we have, only 2 cents of that go to Black businesses. In the Jewish community, the dollar circulates in that community days on end before it exits the community. On average, when the dollar hits us it leaves our community in 6 hours, right? Be mindful and intentional about how you speak to black women if you are a black man. That means uplifting black women. That means not defaming black women. That means protecting black women. Malcolm X also said that the most disrespected person in America is the black woman, and it should be stated. Even though this panel is full of just black men, it is not just black men who are being killed. As a matter of fact, the aspect of Black Lives Matter starts because black women are accustomed to loving us and covering us with their magnanimous protection, and they are the ones who started the movement of Black Lives Matter. So if we as black men honor black women holistically and continuously, that's a positive start. If you are a black woman, do not defame black men. Even if you feel that there are some brothers out there who are not good examples, there are kings who lie among us. Honor and affirm them as well. Do not speak ill towards black men, especially in the company of non-black people, right? So those are some aspects and starts in which we can protect ourselves. Education is also going to be key. And here's the reason why I mention all of these things. Because the reality is what allows for police to feel the gumption to do what they're doing is because they don't anticipate any consequences for their actions. And the reason why they don't anticipate any consequences for their actions is because they assume that due to the poverty of black people, there's not going to be a financial recourse. The fact that there aren't enough black people who are political officials, or that there needs to be more lawyers who are strategically placed in order to generate more successful outcomes in the courtroom. Those are some things that we need to take into consideration, right? And lastly, one of the things that we need to start demanding is we need to start demanding our local officials to therefore have policies that are going to protect the black lives, hold police accountable, find ways to therefore take away power from police unions that consistently give jobs back to police officers who harm and kill and maim our bodies. And we have to get to a place where we say, if you want our vote, these are our demands. You must be someone as a politician who's going to ensure legislation that is going to protect black bodies, help in the creation of black economic opportunities, and help empower educational opportunities for black people as well. Because policies create laws. Laws are therefore serve as a means of protection, not only ideally for what is good, but also for the wrongdoers as well, right? So be all about black people. Do not feel bad about being all about black people. I cannot stress that enough. And those are the ways in which we can kind of engineer a little bit of curtailing of what has happened to us.
Thank you. And Adrian, can you add to that, please?
Yeah, sure. I just love to hear Rudy speak about that stuff. He's so passionate about it, and I believe he's so right. The issues, the question that you asked was, the question you asked here is, the problem is deeply rooted in our past. Is there a way that we can protect history from repeating itself, or stop history from repeating itself? So Rudy touched on a lot of the issues, and I just want to echo one of the things that he said and just put a little bit more pressure on that. We have to love each other. One of the biggest issues that I've seen as I just kind of looked back into history, into slavery and what happened and how it happened, I understood that the slaves that were on, say, one plantation, they weren't necessarily family or friends. They were mixed up. There were different languages, and to some of us who are a little bit more religious, we know that the one place in the Bible that God seemed like he was a little fearful was in the situation with the Tower of Babel. And what he did was he confused the languages. He changed the languages of the people, and that helped to kind of decimate what they were trying to do. And if we look back into history, we see that because they mixed us up, the slaves at that time, we never really found a love for each other and a communication with each other. And if you look at right now in 2020, there's almost this undertone of hate that we may have for each other, the different positions, the different levels that we're at. And we see it, and that's a hard thing to say, but with the many people that we see in the protests for Black Lives Matter, if we ask them the question, you know, I hear your mouth saying Black Lives Matter, but what would happen if I looked at your bank account? Does your bank account say Black Lives Matter? Are you investing into the community? Are you building what we have? And I like the fact that Rudy said we shouldn't feel guilty about building who we are. I think that every race has something very special to give, and it's so important for us to build into our culture, for us to build who we are, instead of just kind of the moment we make a dollar, we spend that right back out into other communities. I think that if we're going to stop history from changing itself, the first thing that we have to do is begin to love ourselves and love each other, and begin to speak the same thing. There's a saying that I have with the group of individuals that I'm working with right now for social justice, and it's let all black mouths say the same thing: peace, unity, and equality. You know what I mean? So once we start to speak the same language, we can start to turn our eyes away from what breaks us up, because we're actually breaking ourselves up from the inside as much as we're being broken up from the outside. I mean, I think if we were to get ourselves more into the political world, we can start to make some changes that will affect our community. We got 3 branches that should operate independently. There should be a checks and balance system. But what we're finding right now is that the executive branch is kind of dipping into both branches. They're the judge and the jury at this point. So I think that if we can get into some of these positions, which many of us are, in effect, we can actually change history. We can stop the progression of what's been going on here.
And I do agree, and I like a couple of comments that was made, and I can't remember them all, but let me try to speak to what I can best recall. The love of Jesus, all right? The epitome of the love of Jesus, the epitome of the cross is truth. What good is the love of Jesus if it's not the truth? What good is the cross if it's not the truth? If we're going to intervene and prevent these societal failures from repeating themselves, then we need to have in place some pre-failure strategy. And there is more than one, and I like to just add to the list. See, it took me a long time to grow into my lips. It took me a long time to accept the fact that these are my lips and they're not going anywhere. They're not going to change. And they represent a history. In order for me to have an accurate image of the world, that's the only way I'm going to prevent anything from being repeated, is for me to see it coming, or it is suggested that it's going to come. So in order for me to have an accurate image of the world, I have to first have an accurate image of myself. And in order for me to do that, one of the ways of preventing this thing from repeating is through me having self-awareness. And with self-awareness, there comes self-knowledge. And with self-knowledge, there's a context now for self-respect. Self-respect says, I have value. And when I have value, I'm going to have a feeling about that value. And either that's going to be high or low, self-esteem. So in order for me to have an accurate image of the world, I have to have an accurate image of myself, because I need to be warned. I need to be able to see. And that brings me to a level of self-respect. It brings me to a level of self-esteem. I can't quote it the way it is written, but he says it something like this. Willie Lynch, all right? He says the mind has a behavior of recorrecting and correcting itself. The mind, if allowed to make contact with some substantial, original historical base, then the mind will recorrect itself and make adjustments. Now, this was the thing he was putting in his paper, in his letter, to say we ought to be careful that it doesn't happen. And so this is what I'm talking about, the summary of me knowing who I am and me not just buying into what people say. So if we're going to deal with the failures of society, then we're going to need a list of pre-failure strategies, which takes me back to something I heard on CNN. And I'll tell you the name, so if you want to look at it or look it up, you can get a better probably recall of what was said. And I think it went something like this. His name was, I think, David Aaron Miller, or Miller, Aaron, David, whatever it is, the three of them, a combination. And he said, the world's most compelling ideology is not nationalism. He said it is not capitalism, and it is not democracy. Now, he's talking about America, but now he's evaluating terrorism. I remember in CNN, and he was giving his opinion of terrorism. He says, and I repeat it, he says, the world's most compelling ideology is not democracy, it is not capitalism, and it is not the ideology that we think should be practiced. But he says it is success. So now we're talking about failures now, how to keep them from returning. When he said that, I mean, he said it a long time ago, but when I was asked to participate in this panel, I remember, and I began to look at, well, if you want to keep, so success is here, and success. The reason why he says success is so important, because success generates constituents, and success generates power. So if you want to keep a people impotent, just tell them, or have someone else tell them, or you tell the world that they're not successful. And so if we're going to deal with societal failures, we need to know and understand what it is to have success, how to address those things. And I believe it's all about self-awareness. That's one of the things that should be added to the list. Self-awareness, which has its path or its trail.
Thank you. Okay, so I have a few questions from those that are watching us via Facebook Live that I'm going to throw in here really quick. And I want to ask this question to Adrilee, because from my understanding, you were doing some of the protesting, correct? Okay, so this question comes from Rico Hashimi via Facebook. He asks, there are unarmed white people that are being killed by police. There are unarmed Latino people that are being killed by police. Why are the white and Latino people not protesting these killings by the police?
That's a good question. What we have to look at is, and please understand when I say this, that concept is falling in line with the all lives matter idea. You know, it's not only happening in this area, it's happening in every area. And I strongly agree with the basis of the all lives matter idea. But be very careful. What we're looking at and what we've been speaking about today is something that is ingrained in America. This is not just an issue that's happening one-off. It's not one here, one there. If we look at it statistically, how the black community is being affected by police brutality, which is what we're talking about right now, doesn't make sense when we line up who we are in society. We're 13%. If it was equal enough for us to then raise the question, for it to be pertinent at this time to say, well, you know, this is happening in the Hispanic community and in the white community and other communities. Is it happening? Absolutely, it's happening. Is it right? It's absolutely just as wrong as it is in our community. Why aren't those communities protesting? Because they're coming from a different place. That's the answer. They're coming from a different place. When I've taught in our schools for many years. It's been 15 years now. And I've taught in other schools. And I quickly realized where I'm needed. But seeing both sides of the coin and seeing how our young men and our young women interact with police and how other young men and young women interact with police, it's very clear that there is an obvious issue. It's not at one school, it's not in one area, it's not with one group of friends. I can be with a group of friends, and I can tell you, because I have friends all over the world, you know, that one of my things is I love to travel, I love to make friends all over the world, but when I'm here at home and if a police car pulls up behind me, I can look in my vehicle and see the expressions, the different expressions on the person's faces that are in the vehicles with me. So I want to be very careful to say this. Is it happening in other communities? Absolutely. Are we condoning it? Well, we don't care about them, we just care about us. That's not what we're saying at all. We're saying that we're fighting against a demon, an animal that has been placed upon us for so many years, even when we were brought to this country. And this is something that hasn't ceased. throughout time that we've been here. So why aren't they protesting? I believe that the issue is not as prominent. The issue is not as the issue is not as prominent to them as it is to us. Are they there? They're there. You know, I've been to the protests, and I'm marching alongside, and I want to raise another point, and hopefully I don't go too far off. I'm marching alongside other brothers from different cultures. And one of the funniest things, and this goes back to something that we said before, you'd honestly be surprised to see who's at these protests. I was incredibly surprised. And the persons that were there were barely us.
That's right.
And I spent 3 different days, and I'm out there with my phone, with my camera, and I'm just recording this, and I sat at home and I just looked through the crowd. And I understand that other cultures are facing this issue too, but they're standing up for what we're doing. So, and I think it's such a beautiful thing, and I think that, and I want to just say this to all our viewers, you got to be careful what you watch on the news, because that is also controlled. We got to be careful. And face to face, I sat there with, and I'll call it out, you know, Channel 4, Channel 6, Channel 7, Channel 10, and I watched as they selected what to shoot. And I was a part of so many peaceful protests that began peaceful and end peaceful, and I just wondered where they got the footage from, and realized that some of that came from other places, other times, even from a movie, World War Z, that they pulled up. I don't know if you saw that. I thought that was hilarious, but hopefully I answered the question. This is not we matter more than everybody else. This is in this vehicle that we call America. We have so many tires, and the tire that's flat right now is our tire, and that's why we're looking at that, and that matters right now in order to get this vehicle to continue moving.
Thank you.
I think it's also a generational issue that we're looking at. A lot of the young people realize that if we allow it to happen to them, it's going to happen to us too. And a lot of other people, they're indifferent, they're apathetic. If it doesn't come to their backyard, they're not going to worry about it. But here in America, we say that we're about liberty and justice for all. And the way you judge a society is how they treat the most vulnerable. That's whether or not what that society says its ideals are true or they're false. And if our ideals, liberty and justice for all, are going to be true, they have to be true for everybody. And if it's not true because of the color of your skin, then it's not true for anyone. And I think a lot of the young people realize that there is a problem with the way people are being treated in the black communities, whether they're white, Latino, or whatever the case may be. And if we allow the police department, which is just another branch of the government, so let's say if we allow the government to get out of control, where does it stop? When does it come to my door? When does it come to my child? When does it happen to my husband? When does it happen to my brother, to my sister, to my wife, to my daughter? Those are the questions that people of conscience are asking themselves around this country and around this world. And those that are stepping up are those that are willing to be honest about the reality that if we allow it to continue, it won't stop.
I'm going to have Rudy also answer this question. Again, the question is, why are the white and Latino people not protesting the killings that are happening by police within their communities as well?
So for me, my question to that question is, why ask that question in the first place? Why is All Lives Matter a retort or response to Black Lives Matter in the first place? And I think that really needs to be genuinely analyzed, right? We have almost no issue ever, for the most part, when a grieved party articulates how they've been abused, except when it is Black people. And I think it's interesting because a lot of the All Lives Matter crowd, and then we got some Black folk too who speak that that ideology. And one of the things I want for church folk especially to think about is how invested are church folk genuinely invested in the growth and betterment of a society? Or is it that many times certain church folk want to resist involvement because they're invested in the destruction of society in order for them to make it to heaven sooner? And the thought is that many times within the parameters of a church, people are interested in what Jesus can do rather than who Jesus is. What Jesus can do is provide usherance into the kingdom. So people go to church and are invested in that, want to make it to heaven. But who Jesus is somebody who is definitely mindful of the oppressed and the marginalized. It would not make sense for us to visualize Jesus saying, why y'all talking so much, right? They're not talking so much. Why y'all talking so much? Why do you have an issue with it? Why are you talking about your life matters? Then the different question needs to be, what would happen if Black lives and Native American indigenous lives actually mattered in America? What would that mean for the globe at large? Because undoubtedly, these are the two groups that were castigated in the lowest rungs of racial hierarchy. America was built on genocide, right? Millions of Native Americans were killed, literally, for the establishment of this land. America is built on the enslavement of African people in the millions. In large part, the Industrial Revolution was help funded by the slave trade. And so there is no America without Native American blood being shed and being murdered and being mutilated and being killed. There is no America without Black bodies being mutilated and shamed and killed in order to generate capital. So the thought process needs to be Common Sense 101. Black people are being more vocal about it because we've been the one most unheard on this particular issue. Another thing that people need to be wary of is when we say and we compare raw numbers. Yes, raw numbers, white people are killed by police more than Black people, but to Adri's point and others, right, there's disproportionality. The reality is this, not all murders are the same, because it doesn't suggest that there isn't a moment where police murder someone in self-defense. That does occur, but why is it, or how many white individuals are killed in the way that George Floyd was killed, or Breonna Taylor was killed? How many white folk are killed by vigilantes like Ahmaud Arbery or Trayvon Martin? It is a specifically unique thing. I have no problem standing next to my Mexican brothers and sisters and Latin brothers and sisters when it comes to aspects of deportation and the anti-immigration sentiment that has been exacerbated by the current person who's upholding the White House, right? I have no issues with that. You will never hear me say, man, why is it that there aren't some Caribbean people marching about deportations when sometimes Caribbean people get deported? Because it definitely happens to those who are Latin at a disproportional rate. And as Black people, and I don't know if the person asked the question is Black, but if the person is Black, I am deeply troubled by these kinds of questions, right? And I'm deeply troubled by Black people articulating the all lives matter aspect. Lastly, I want to say this. America in large part has been built on the legacy of anti-Blackness. And the way that white America was able to do so successfully is that they know that the human, regardless of race or gender or religion or whatever, values life in their own life. It is hardwired in our DNA to be survivalists, right? It is hardwired for us to be that. So it behooved the slave who wanted his life to be lived to snitch on the other slave masters, on the other slaves when they were planning rebellion. Because those Black folk essentially find themselves in a space where they are wanting to distance themselves from the rest of the black folk because they recognize that to be attached to blackness is death. So the question becomes, how do I know black lives are not mattering enough? Not only is it that white people are killing black lives and white police officers, the police officers in general, are killing black lives, but I notice because Kanye West is telling us that slavery is a choice. I noticed that Candace Owens is being extremely antagonistic about the progress of black people and articulating her own vision of progress for the black people rooted in a conservatism that has been racist modernly in a historical context, because they themselves are distancing themselves from black lives. So when black people are distancing themselves from other black people, that's how I know black lives are not mattering enough, and that is why it is unique to us, and the question should never be asked, and the sentiment of all lives matters should never be articulated, because it's only articulated when black people are trying to finally stand up for ourselves and our lives.
I'd like to jump right in there on that because I agree with some of what you said, but not all of what you said. And let me just give you some perspective on where Meadows is coming from. I was born and raised in a place called Do or Die, Bed-Stuy. That's Brooklyn, New York. I didn't know what a Neverland was, so I changed my name to Earl. My 5% name was King Allah, Self-Savior, I equal Master. As a teenager, I was on a cadre as a special bodyguard to Huey P. Newton when he was released from prison in 1970. In the 60s, we were taught to make our own guns, zip guns. In the 70s, when I went to 10 different high schools in New York, 10 different times, I sold guns every place I could because I believed a revolution was coming. But when I came into this church and understood what happened on the cross for me, and then I began to see that not only this church, but many churches, we were biased in our truth. And I began to say, and will continue to say, because of this, that all lives matter, and I want you to grasp this point. This church has not taught us, and maybe you and maybe others, that there's no such thing as white dirt. And Adam was made from the dust of the ground. And there's no such thing as white dirt. And so, if I call myself Negro, then I have to go to the back of the bus. If I call myself colored, then I have to drink at a different water fountain. If I call myself African American, then I exclude the Arawak, I exclude the Saboni, I exclude the Taino, the Haitian, the Trinidadian, the Jamaican. I exclude them if I call myself African American. So I call myself black. You know why? Because black is not a color for me. See, if black is a color, then it is represented by that's something that's restricted. But for me, black has never been a color. Black is an experience. And the reason why I point finger at the church is because many churches only tell part of the argument, the creation story, how God knelt down and God formed man from the dust of the ground and God into his nostrils and he became a living soul. But we never ever say that there's no such thing as white dirt. And let me just piggyback off that to myself and share this with you. There's something called church truth that we need to prevent these things from returning also. Because church truth says, I think it's Southern Works, page 54, though you have not been active participant in enforcing slavery upon the Negroes, terminology used for that time, you are not absolved, you are not relinquished from the responsibility of performing specific or special acts for relieving the Negro of the burden of the results of slavery. Now, here's the second thing I want you to get before you understand why I say all lives matter. Because church truth is not complete, and we have leaders, Whether they're from the pew or whether they're from the office or whether they're from Silver Springs, we have leaders that allow the lie to continue. Now, let me just go just a little bit further, and maybe you'll understand why I say all lives matter. Because when we see Patriarchs and Prophets, page 45, and we look at 1958 edition, we don't look for 1890 edition, page 45. 1890 confirms what I said. First, I'm arguing from Scripture. Scripture says that God made it from the dust of the earth. And mind you now, the only white earth on this planet is sand, the other is clay, and sand is the result of erosion. Erosion is the consequence of sin. And in clay, nothing can live, and clay is the consequence of sin. The only white dirt on this planet is sand and clay. So when you read Patriarchs and Prophets, page 45, 1890, ask yourself this question: how come the church changed it and it only promotes 1958? 1890 says this: Adam was neither white nor sallow. There's no such thing as white dirt. Therefore, Adam was a man of color, and black is not a color. And every nation, kindred, and tongue came from Adam. And the reason why all lives matter is because we are children of Adam, and Adam was black.
Okay, thank you for that. From my understanding, Rudy would like to respond to Pastor Meadows.
Yes, so one of the things I want to respond, in African tradition, we respect and honor the elders, and we call them Baba. Baba Meadows, Elder Meadows, I appreciate your wisdom. I want to respond in that context, we are not in disagreement in the aspect of black being the original or the origin, if you will, of humanity, right? What I was simply responding to more so is that what is the intent of all lives matter when it is stated? In the context, when people are saying all lives matter, as a response to Black Lives Matter, it is not because they genuinely concern themselves with a collective of saying, you're right, because all lives matter, so do Black lives, so now let us work in unison. It is often a response to therefore ignore the aspects of, or depression, or the oppression rather, of Black people. And if you don't want to call us Black people, whether it be African people, people of African descent, the reality is this, right? We know that race is a social construct, and that is the language in which many people speak. And so when we talk about speaking, the question becomes, what is the intent? What you just dropped, right, is something that very, 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 very few people know about, whether you're looking at it through the Judeo-Christian context, which you gave, or whether it is those who don't believe in that Judeo-Christian context, but understand essentially that the oldest remains were discovered in Africa. Regardless, we know that the origin of humankind from a color spectrum is more that looks like you and I than our opposite, right? The question I'm getting at, or rather the answer I'm getting at, is more so the fact that people weaponize the phraseology of all lives matter in order to discount a specific group of God's children, and that is the reason why that's problematic. But the aspect of the fact, because here's what's interesting, if you were to tell many of the people what you just said who articulate all lives matter, they would probably be upset with you because they love their whiteness and the ideology and the power in which it brings. And that speaks to the fact that all lives matter has been weaponized to speak out against us. If all lives matter was used in a context where it says, yes, all lives matter, so how can we, or I, who is a European descent man, stand next to you, an African descent man, to show society that all lives matter? I would grant that, but that is not what happened. And lastly, I will say this. Even if people get caught up on the term Black Lives Matter, what people should not get caught up on or should not ignore is the fact that that movement, it is not just a phraseology, it's a movement. That movement has reduced police killings of Black bodies since its inception, right? It's almost like people have an issue with the term civil rights movement. Regardless if people have issue with the name of it, no one can deny the aspect of the civil rights movement or the Black Power movement and the power of El Shabazz, Malcolm X, and the Black Panther Party, of which you, which was a really cool story of you defending Huey P. and the like, right? Understanding the aspect of the strategy and understanding how people are using words to go against that strategy is key.
Thank you, Rudy. Okay, so I'm going to ask Rudy one more question, and then we're going to move on to the legal context. Rico Hashimi asked Rudy from Facebook, what about Black criminals that kill innocent Black people when they commit their crimes? Why aren't Black people protesting these unjustified killings? This is happening in large numbers, especially in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Atlanta.
So, first of all, again, I want to echo that I am proud to be a part of this panel. And I want to give a special so Baba Meadows, Elder Meadows, and Attorney Brown, amazing men. I want to give a special shout out to my brother Adri, the homie, and something he articulated about not believing in everything that the news tells you. So first of all, anti-Blackness is not just a sentiment that exists amongst whites towards Blacks, but it also exists towards Blacks towards ourselves, right? And one of the things I want for you, dear brother or sister, I don't know based upon the name, and I say this with all due respect, to understand is that many times there are protests against these murders. There are protests against these issues that are not nearly as publicized as is the case of when it's police shootings. That's number one. Secondly, murder is all about proximity. If we don't do this kind of rhetoric towards white people, we should not do this rhetoric merely towards Black people. Most white people are killed by white people. Most Hispanic people are killed by Hispanic people. The notion of Black on Black violence in the context of it being seen as an anomaly is falsity, right? The majority of people killed are killed by people who look like them. I think the different question needs to be asked, which is, what more can we do in order to ensure more brothers don't kill one another, right? And again, a lot of that relates back to issues of policy as well as lack of presence. And also, one has to take into consideration that if the thought is that police are here to protect us, and there are instances of violence within our own community, why is it that many members of the community don't feel comfortable in calling the police? Why is it that they feel as though those individuals who are manifesting violence in our communities will get to them first before the police can protect them, right? And so a lot of that has to deal with actually the relationship between the police and the community. If the community genuinely and authentically believed that the police was there for them and is there for their betterment and can offer a certain sense of protection, I think it would be a greater deterrent of violence. I think that's up to the police to generate a better relationship in the community. Another aspect that needs to be taken into consideration is the fact that many cities and counties and the like create a system in which school funding is linked to the value of tax property. That should not be the case. There should be more dedication on behalf of many individuals within the dynamics of the school board and those who are the supervisors of education to therefore not only properly fund predominantly Black schools, but also make sure that there's critical engagement and successful engagement in the classroom. there also needs to be more aspects in regards to engineering entrepreneurial activities in our communities. Because here's the fact. A lot of the violence that comes in our community is often drug related. Why is there an incentive or a need to therefore sell drugs? Because of lack of enterprisal and economic opportunities. If enterprisal and economic opportunities and educational opportunities were to have improved in our communities, then therefore we would be in a much better condition. The issue essentially that's baked into that question or the mentality or sentimentality is that there is a belief by many people that black people are inherently criminal. And that is absolutely wrong. People are often responding to the condition and the environment in which they are in. And here's another thing that needs to be asked. I do not want to hear people talk about black violence if they're unwilling to talk about the violence that has been meted out by white individuals historically throughout this country, right? If you're getting so gun-ho on a black person killing a black person, which is a tragedy and is a concern, but you are not thinking about the fact that white Americans killed millions of Native Americans, or you are not thinking about the fact of the many lynchings that occurred, or you are not thinking about all of those things, and you feel as though this is a bigger issue or more pressing issue because it speaks to somehow that we are worse and we are more inherently violent. There's a lot of things that need to be analyzed within that. Here's something that's not discussed nearly enough. In the midst of the people talking essentially about black people killing black people, what people often don't discuss is that acts of violence as far as murder has actually gone down by a lot since the early 90s. Black people are killing each other a whole lot less than we used to. Miami is an excellent example. Whether we recognize it or not, because it's not as reported in the news, murders have gone down a significant amount in Miami. They want you to see a narrative in which they're focusing on certain aspects. And this is how I know that. Every time this question is brought up, someone brings up Chicago. Every single time, someone brings up Chicago. And the fact that someone brings up Chicago speaks to the fact that there seems to be, especially upon the likes of a Fox News, to hyperly focus on Chicago and not focus on other statistics that show not only, number one, how there has been disproportionality in the justice system towards black people, but also the fact that we've actually been killing each other a lot less, right? And that's not a part of the equation. And the reason why it's not a part of the equation is because it easily allows for black people to be the scapegoat of issues of policy as well as the environment in which it was created. And here's the last thing I'll say. The person who asked that question, do a lot of research on how drugs got in the community in the first place. Do research on the fact that marijuana was not deemed illegal until a white man named Harry Anslinger literally convinced Congress that somehow weed made white women want to have sex with black men, and then Congress decided it needed to become a drug that is illegal, and making that illegal therefore exacerbates the criminality of black people as it relates to incarceration and the like. Until we address the fact that if black people came to America as equals and were not enslaved and did not have to deal with Jim Crow and did not have to deal with drugs, in which quite often the CIA was very well aware of what the Contras in Nicaragua was bringing in order to fund the war that America could no longer fund for them. So they were able to funnel the drug money that they were using in order to fund their war, which therefore brought more aspects of crack and also the violence that pursued because of it, and therefore exacerbated the murders. If people and I want to deal with that history, they should not articulate the aspect of black on black violence.
Can I speak on that just briefly? I know we're about to jump into another segment, but I was on Fox News, which Rudy just mentioned, and Jesse Waters was the host. And he threw in that red herring, that black on black violence in Chicago. And I said to Jesse, I said, well, he said, when 91% of black people are killed by other black people, why do you even care about this? Very simply, 87% of white people are killed by another white person. As Rudy said, It's a matter of proximity. You tend to deal with the people who are around you. The difference is the government is killing people. A police officer represents the government. The power that they have to stop you, the power that they have to arrest you, comes from the government. The government enslaved people. The government made segregation. The government said you had to sit in the back of the bus. And when the government is killing people, that's a problem, and you got to deal with it.
In addition to that, maybe just add something before you move. I don't know if you're going to another subject. The primary cause of violence in America is the systematic, institutionalized imbalance of power. Here's that power thing again. Because remember, the reason why the Mayflower Compact and the Constitution was written was for this stuff called this sovereign power stuff. So when the primary cause of violence in America is the systematic, institutionalized imbalance of power. And whenever there's an imbalance of power, there's violence. And so when we talk about proximity, I think of the home, one of the four institutions in all communities. There's the home, there's the church, there's the bank, there's the school, the four primary institutions in the community. And when there's an imbalance of power, take the home for instance, then there's domestic violence. And so when we start talking about how to deal with and to judge and to take a look at black on black crime, or whether we compare the numbers of that to white on white crime, and what we also must consider, again, I go back to the base. You see, obviously, the love of Jesus is not enough to bring everybody together. So we got to start using additional strategies. And this is why I say we need to have the same voice. Who are we? Well, there's only one race, but we allow ourselves to think that there's two. Well, there's only one America, but it was determined by 1965 by the Warren Commission that there's two Americas, white America, black America. We could change that by how we allow values to transition and how we allow the transmission of values. Because we can see these things and we can speak about these things, but the question is, what is my awareness? Do I embrace it or do I distance myself from that? So therefore, when we start talking about, for example, Chicago, and I was on the west side of Chicago for 8 years. And we did a couple of things there. One of the things that I just want you to take note of, on every intersection, we placed 10 people. That means there was 40 people on every intersection, the majority, the base of West Chicago. And the reason why we did it, because we had an idea, we had a movement that our presence, a positive presence, could influence negative activity. And from what we understood, what happened during that time, that crime decreased. They talk about Chicago because, again, they want to promote the idea. They want to promote and keep in front of us failure. Because all they have to say is, you're a failure. They don't have to begin to use the language with regard to us as a people. All they have to do, and here's another thing they do. They'll go inside the group of what we call our people and start selecting ethnic groups of our people and saying your group is better than that group. And and then they practice it. I'll leave that there for right now.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the legal context of this subject, and I want to direct these questions to Endel. First, in theory, how does the law protect citizens from being targets for this kind of attack?
In theory, the law of this land all flows from the Constitution, right, which is the law that all the other law comes from. States can make laws, but if they make a law that goes against the Constitution, that law is invalid because the Constitution controls. So constitutionally, we have the Fourth Amendment that keeps us, that makes it illegal to have unlawful searches and seizures. We have the Fifth Amendment, which you've heard people say, I plead the Fifth, which is against self-incrimination as well as loss of liberty without due process. We have the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, and we have other constitutional remedies. But in reality, these things only happen when law enforcement is transparent and accountable. When there's no transparency to what is actually happening on the streets, what is actually happening in the case, then the law is almost irrelevant. When there's no accountability for what an officer does, then the law becomes irrelevant. In order for the legal protections that we have under the Constitution to matter, we must have a justice system, we must have law enforcement that is both transparent and accountable. We have the federal system where, in many cases, goes back to times of slavery, where you didn't want to release the slaves in certain states. We had the Civil War. That was a federal issue at some point in time. Then we went on to segregation, when schools were desegregated, when you could no longer segregate spaces, and certain states didn't want to abide by that. The National Guard came in. The federal government came in and said, you can't do that. When you had certain states that wanted to not do anything about lynchings, they would have lynchings all the time. The police might be at the lynching too, watching, and they would not stop the people that were involved in that. The federal government had to step in. So the Constitution and the federal law has always been the watchdog of what's happening on the local level for law enforcement. Now we have 1983 actions where if someone experienced police brutality or their constitutional rights are violated by a police department, then they can sue under 1983. So those are some of the legal protections. But in order for the legal protections to have teeth, we have to have transparent and accountable law enforcement.
Okay, and how can we go about affecting these changes as citizens?
Okay. One of the most powerful things that has happened in recent times is the camera phone. This thing right here. It has allowed everyday people to record their encounters with the police and share it with the world. Maybe 2 days ago, there was an incident in Buffalo. There was a 70-something-year-old man, and he was the Buffalo State Police or whatever, New York State Police were out. And this 70-something-year-old man, I don't know why he was approaching the officer, must have talked to him or may have touched his arm, but one of the officers came from behind and violently pushed this man, and he fell back, and then blood was coming out of his ear, and one of the officers was thinking to reach down to help him, and the other officer grabbed him and said no, and they kept going. Do you know what that police report said? The police report said, which they wrote and they swore to, said that that man tripped. George Floyd's police report doesn't mention anything about them pinning him down, kneeling on his neck. It said on the way to the hospital or as we were transporting him, he had a medical issue. The camera phone has made what is happening in the streets more transparent. If we did not have that brave young woman that videotaped what was happening to George Floyd, those people pleading, him begging for his life, him saying, I can't breathe, him crying out for his mother, the nation, the world would never know what happened there. So the camera phone has been extremely important in creating transparency for what is happening in the interactions between law enforcement and citizens. The body-worn camera is another important tool that has been instituted and needs to be regulated so that officers must use body-worn camera when they interact with a citizen. The other things that need to be done in order to make sure there's accountability, we have to take a look at the Police Bill of Rights. Those exist in certain states, like Florida, where the police officer has special rights, additional due process that other people don't have. Whenever there's an incident, whenever there's a shooting, whenever they kill someone, they don't have to answer questions for a certain amount of time. They get to read all the reports that other people write before they give their account of what happened. And you can imagine how this can lead to corruption and people lying and bending the facts. Many times the camera has showed us something totally different than what was reported by the police. You speak of Chicago. There was an incident with Laquan McDonald who was shot several times. Police report said he lunged at me with a knife, but there was a camera. And that camera showed that not only did Laquan McDonald not lunge at that officer, he never even went in his direction. They kept this buried for more than a year. It was only until people filed lawsuits to get the footage released that all of a sudden they said, you know what? We need to arrest this officer. And he was prosecuted, and he served prison time for that shooting. The camera gives us transparency, and transparency gives us accountability. There are other legal things that we can use, but we have to always remember voting has consequences. Elections have consequences. And the type of people you have in office, the type of courts you have matter. One of the things that have happened recently is the erosion of the Fourth Amendment protections for communities. Another thing that has happened is that the things that hold police officers accountable are being slowly eroded in the Supreme Court with the decisions that are being made. One of the big legal issues or the legal doctrines that control what happens with officers is qualified immunity. And what that says is that if an officer is operating, doing their job, they cannot be liable, they cannot be legally liable unless they operate outside of the normal standards, unless they're doing something that is so bold and brazenly illegal that we have to punish them. Only very few cases get this type of protection. And when you have the person that sits down at, 1600 Black Lives Matter Avenue, is that the name of it now? When you have that person that's appointing justices that are quote-unquote pro-police, which really just means that they're going to allow the police to do whatever they want, and they don't want there to be any type of accountability. They continue to erode the legal protections that we, the community, that normal, everyday citizens have against when the police is abusing them. So I think that is what, those are some of the legal protections that we have. But if you have any specific legal questions or what we can do as a community, I'd be glad to get into that.
Okay, I'm going to go to the social context, and if we get some questions from Facebook, we'll go ahead and include those as well. Adrian, I want to ask you, what does this kind of tragedy do to our communities and from a brighter scope, our society?
Wow, that's a really good question. I'm going to speak from just a very literal standpoint in terms of what I've seen in my field, education, and what I'm seeing now as I'm standing up for social justice. When things like this happen, and I hope I'm speaking directly to the people here, I'm no camera, Matt, but what I find that is that in our communities, what's happening, am I seeing this camera here? Okay, almost, okay. The most hurtful thing that happens is that we have division in our community. When a tragedy like this happens, there's so many stories that are out there, and I'm just so convinced that there are people who are the degradation of society that are also adding to these stories, adding untruths out there, and it divides our people. I was hurt to see, as I tried to stand up for what was right, and as I tried to help with the protest, the peaceful protest, so many people were saying, hey, Adrian, you got to get home, don't be a part of that, and that's the wrong set of black people, and you're going to get hurt, and you're going to get shot, and you're going to get tear gassed, and don't stand up for that, and just be safely at home. You should be safe. It was hurtful because that's the place where we're needed, and I listened to President Barack Obama, our ex-president, Barack Obama, say that this country was actually built on protests. When we finally stand up and stand for what we believe is right, we begin to get the ears of the people who can make the decisions. And I think that's a part of the problem also, because we need to be in the position where we're also making those decisions. But when things like this happen, it really affects our community where we're kind of used to not bonding together. And the protests are a beautiful way to kind of get together and to hear one voice and to hear one direction as to what we're going to do. But it kind of doesn't work out that way. And I'm sad to see that, and I'm sad to hear that there's so many voices, so many conflicting voices that are helping to just break up what we have, whether it be the news, whether it be social media, whatever we're seeing. So my hope, and I'm just going to kind of add this into to answering your question, but my hope is that through these tragedies that we're seeing, that we begin to come together, right? And I'm going to say this again, may all black mouths say the same thing: peace, equality, unity, because it's only in those parameters that we can see positive, effective change. If you look back into, and I hate to go back here, but when we look back into slavery, one of the methods that the slave masters used to control us was giving us different positions, putting us in different places. And we're seeing that now, right? So the more that we kind of separate our ideas, the more that we look at ourselves as higher or lower, smarter or not smarter, we're just separating ourselves. So we got to get to a place where we say, you know what, there are pertinent issues that we need to deal with right now, and there may be some other issues of black on black crime. There's a lot of different things that we need to fix in our society. However, we need to have all voices saying the same thing in this season right now, so we can start to exact those changes that we know we need to exact. So unfortunately, that's what I see, how it affects us.
Thank you. And Pastor Meadows, what does this kind of tragedy do to our culture as people of color living in America?
Well, I believe I kind of touched on that a little bit, but there's a little more probably clarity that could come to that. And I said it, but I want to come back and revisit it this way. Different boats, same boat, different bus stops. All of us came here on a boat. Same boat, different bus stops. There are 3 societal worlds in every community. Now, whether it's all of the people, most of the people, or a combination of the people, they come from one of these 3 societal worlds. There's the world of reman, the world of command, the world of demand. The world of reman says, we're going to count you, stand up, you got 5 more years, okay, on the wake up. The world of supply and demand deals with commerce and capitalism and competition. The world of command, yes sir, no sir, about face, and you'll find that these people, our neighbors, have 1, 2, or a combination of all 3 of these backgrounds in their family. And I come to understand that this tragedy can cause a shift in these values that can be conflicting. And that is that what I see is that my neighbor has a right to expect from me that I will raise, develop, all members of my family, challenge all members of my family to respect property and the right to life. But then in summary, 2 things. 1, as many have said, protest. Now, I've heard leaders say that we are not activists. I heard leaders say we should not protest. Well, I believe that's contrary to the principle that's established in the Bible. I really do. For the Bible says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Because when Jesus was given or shown the coin, and Jesus asked, the question was asked of Jesus, should we pay taxes? And Jesus says, whose face is on the coin? And he said, Caesar. He says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's unto the Lord. In other words, whatever the government asks you to do, or whatever opportunity you have to participate in the government, as long as it doesn't conflict with your relationship with Jesus Christ, you're operating within render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Therefore, it is right for you to vote. And if you're going to vote, you should be an intelligent voter. meaning you should attend some of these meetings, whether they're Republican or whether they're Democrat. That means you should register, and you should also recommend the church to register to vote. That's being an activist. I've heard them say, we are not activists. I heard them say recently that we should not protest. Well, see, protest has to do with voice, and the Constitution says, remember now, see, we forgot, and I can't but emphasize this. The Constitution is based upon the Mayflower Compact, and the Mayflower Compact is based upon two prophetic biblical principles: civil liberty, religious liberty. So when we start talking about protests, we're talking about upholding the Constitution, upholding the two principles upon which it was built, which is called the Mayflower Compact. So when we're operating within render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, we're operating within principle. And we should be operating by the counsel and by the instruction of our leaders. But I hear them say, we're not activists, we're pastors. See, this is how the Black Lives Movement failed. The church failed it. And if you look at our church missed the boat on the civil rights movement. And look like we're about to miss this boat too.
Well, thank you, Pastor. I'm going to ask this question. We have another question via Facebook that I would like to direct to Rudy. This question comes from, excuse me if I say your name wrong, Eli Tolentino. And he says, or she, all lives matter. What am I supposed to tell my son that is biracial? He is 48% African American, 18% Asian, and 30% European. His life matters.
I think to that question, let me actually, I'll answer that question, but I want to circle back and add a little bit to what Andel had mentioned about what was going on in Buffalo, right? So not only did they push down the 75-year-old man, but it also, and he was bleeding and had to be hospitalized. But their police officers in the video did not help him and walked away from him. And 57 members of the police officers of Buffalo resigned from participating in any future protest, not because of virtue, but because in support and solidarity of their police officers who had been suspended because of the action that they took, right? News just came out, so this may be news to some people, but Minneapolis City Council has voted to dismantle the police and to defund the police and to instead offer a new public safety mechanism. That's going to be in the works, so I just wanted to add that. No one is saying, dear brother or sister, that the life of your child does not matter. I think what you say to your child is to always be a protector of justice for all people, so that when Black people are grieved, your child serves the Black community. When Asian people are grieved, your child serves the Asian community. When Latin people are grieved, your child serves the Latin community. When white folk who are poor and from the Appalachian region are grieved because of their economic plight, your child be the one that stands up for that community. If all lives truly matter, then we need to stop articulating that it only matters when it only affects all of us as it relates to issues of injustice. No, we show that all lives matter when we are there for everyone who is grieved, especially and in particularly when people are uniquely grieved, right? I think that it's beautiful that your child has an array of cultural references, and that's awesome. I think, though, that one of the things that has to be taken into consideration is that same child, depending upon his or her phenotype, right? Depending upon their look, can be treated by police if that child looks more black than not, right? There have been instances where people who are biracial, but because of them looking closer to black than white or else otherwise, have been uniquely harmed by police, because the police do not care about the shade of black, just as long as you have some black in you. President Obama's life matters. He's raised of a white mother. He is born of a white mother. He was also raised by white grandparents, but he's also a descendant of an African, in particular, Kenyan father. And yet, the person who occupies the White House now still thought it was in his right to ask for a birther, or rather ask for birth certificates because of his birther movement. And he did not do that because Barack Obama was half white. He did it because he was half black. And the moment where we discount that black people are uniquely marginalized and oppressed, not only does it do a disservice to those who are black on both sides, but it will also definitely do a disservice to those like your child who also are half black. And that needs to be taken into consideration. And I will lastly say this: God forbid, if something were to ever happen to a child, like has happened to some others who's biracial, and it was because of that person's perceived blackness, even though there is another half that is not black, would the position all lives matter the way it's articulated, and I don't want to make assumptions for you, the questioner, would it still be articulated the same way? I think that it's really interesting that when all lives matter is articulated, no one has an issue when people are focusing specifically on certain diseases. When the ALS challenge was taking place, no one said, hey, all diseases matter. Let's make sure we do a challenge for all diseases. Because there's an understanding that, yes, all diseases can ravish families and break apart homes. But someone had the idea to make a challenge for ALS, and no one had issue with that, right? And so, yes, we all matter. But if we all matter, then that means we must stand up for those who are marginalized and oppressed. And lastly, to answer that question, again, thinking about the example of Jesus, if Jesus had the mindset that all lives matter in the context of I'm going to give, or essentially everybody, the same set of intentionality or focus, his movement would not be as successful. It was successful because Jesus understood that those who needed him were those who were casted out of society, those who were seen as the sinners, those who were seen as the poor, those who were seen as the marginalized. Jesus did not say, well, you know what? Got to think of these Pharisees too. So because of the Pharisees and their privilege and their elitism, I'm just going to treat everyone the exact same. Every situation is not the exact same. This is the reason why Jesus chose essentially to be from Nazareth. This is the reason why Jesus hung out with those who were deemed clearly as sinners, because of that humility of spirit that they had, that they knew and understood that every situation is unique. This is what I would tell your child.
Thank you for that, Rudy. Another question I want to bring about with the social context: what can we as individuals and as church in this community what can we do as individuals and as a church in this community to protect our community, our culture, ourselves, and our children?
I'd like to answer that, but I also like to just back up just one step a bit. There was something that I've never seen in my life since the 50s. I've never seen anything like it in terms of protests. There was a white young lady who had a sign, and the sign said, "White silence is violence." I thought that was so impactful. I thought that was so profound. I don't know if anyone has seen it, but it's something that we need to take and we need to archive it, and we need to bring it to maybe Sabbath school, maybe the 11 o'clock service, maybe to AY. I just want to share that with you. But now, in regards to how do we address, or what are some of the things that this tragedy may cause in our society, when we begin looking at our young people, the first thing they're going to do is begin to ask questions. They're going to begin distrusting the church. They're going to begin distrusting God, and they're going to ask questions, for example, like, where is God, and why did he permit this, and why is this going on, and how come he doesn't stop this? I thought God was love, and the reason why we're not getting the answers that we should get, for two reasons. One, because the pulpit is too far from the pew. The second, because there's a gentrification of the pulpit. Now, you understand, you have seen gentrification in your neighborhood, and you thought it was just white people coming in and taking over the property of black people. No, look at the definition. Gentrification actually means to make a people, a person, a project polite by its appearance and polite by its behavior according to middle-class values. And our young people, if there's no reference, then there's no reverence. If there is no reference at home, then when they come to church, there's no reverence in the church. If there is no reference in the church, in other words, what they need to hear, if there is no reference in the church, then there is no reverence or respect for God. And so these kind of tragedies, without answers, without solutions, without options, without a source and resource for power. You see, we can talk about prayer, but I have not heard people say things about prayer that should be said about prayer. And there are four things, and let me just say one. Why does God ask us to pray? And he already knows what we're going to ask him. You see, and I believe when we begin to look at that, we'll find out why we should be praying. Because God already knows, but he asks us to pray. But since he already knows and he asks us to pray, then that means prayer is not for God. There's a greater value of prayer for me. And we're not telling our young people that. We're not leading them in prayer in regards to that value of prayer. So therefore, prayer is preparatory for the blessing. I want you to get that. Prayer is preparatory for the blessing, and prayer is therapeutic. It is good for you to talk it over with God because it prepares you for the blessing. There's a lot more, but just take note. Pray about it, but know why you're praying.
Wow, that was good. That was good.
Stay woke.
I want to chip in for that question. Let me just pull it up really quick. What could we do as individuals in our community? That question, I looked at how the question was broken down, and I think that we have to be careful with that question. I think that question could be a little dividing, and that's a little scary. But I remember reading a story about Jesus where he was out doing his thing. He was blessing and teaching and doing his thing, and the disciples decided that they would go off and they would kind of do their thing, you know, cast out demons and the like. And the disciples happened upon a group of other people that they just didn't recognize, and they looked and they're like, all right, well, let's check these people out. I'm just paraphrasing here. And they found a group of people who were casting out demons in Jesus' name. And they were a little upset about that because they're like, yo, you don't know Jesus, you don't know us. What are you doing? And so they went back and reported it to Jesus, and Jesus said something that I thought was really profound. And he says, Are they casting out demons in my name? Yeah, Jesus, look what they're doing over here. You got to come check this out. And Jesus simply calmed them and said, listen, if they're not against us, then they're for us. They're using my name. And they're like, well, Jesus, they're not doing it the way that we do it. And don't you have a problem with that? And Jesus kind of just said, no, let them do their thing. And I thought that was profound. In our community, right now, as we face a lot of these problems, we're looking at some of our brothers and sisters and we're saying, you know what, I don't like the way that they're doing it. I don't like the way that they're acting up. And I don't like the way that they're doing this. And you know what, I'm just going to sit back, I'm going to fold my hands, and I'm not going to be a part of that. But I think that at this time, how we're going to really move forward is, number one, we have to unify again. Am I saying we should go out there looting? No, I don't believe that we're out there looting in the first place. I've been to half of the protests down here, probably about 80% of the protests that have gone on down here. I needed to see my people for myself, and I needed to develop my own news. And so I saw it for myself, and I don't think that's what we're doing. But I think that we are splitting each other with these ideas that are being fed to us. So I think that our action for change is, number one, we have to unify. And I'll be completely honest with you. I'm not the biggest fan of protesting. I'm not the biggest fan, especially when it's not organized, because you get a lot of people in one area, and if there's no leader and if it's not organized, it could easily kind of go astray. And so when I'm there, I'm a little worried. But you know what? My people are there. And when I say my people, I'm not just speaking about what we would call an African American or black person. No, my people are there who stand up in the face of injustice. And I say, you know what? This is not my favorite method. But I am going to inconvenience myself at any point in time. And people are asking me, Adrian, when you find out about these protests, let me know. You're there by yourself. But the honest truth is, I hear about it and I inconvenience myself so I could fall into unity with my people. And as I started to do that, God just kind of opened up a way for me to be of influence. And I just thought it was an awesome thing. So I say this, if we're going to move forward, we have to take a moment to stop nitpicking at exactly how people are doing things. We have to inconvenience ourselves, because we have been inconvenienced in a system that has been running for so long. And if we just kind of follow the system and sit back and allow it to happen, we're going to be far more inconvenienced, and this is going to repeat itself. So I just want to encourage us, if we're going to really move forward, let's not think about how to move forward as an individual. Here's what I see. There are some families, some black families, that are privileged, and they're very comfortable. And usually those are the families that are sitting at home and saying, I'll watch it on TV, and you guys, be safe out there. And it's usually the persons who are less fortunate who are making the time to kind of go out there. This just kind of builds another whole set of a divide for us, okay? And I keep on going back to this idea of unity, unity, unity. We have to unify, or else we will not be able to move forward as a people. We acknowledge this as a problem for us, but it's not an individual problem. So we have to put away the idea of individuality right now. I told a friend of mine just the other day, I said, you know what? I am actually George Floyd. And he looked at me like, dude, what are you talking about? Get out of here, right? And I told him, I said, that officer, granted we found out there's some relationship between the Asian officer and Floyd somehow, but the officer who actually took Floyd's life didn't necessarily know Floyd. It was just a black man that, he heard they did something wrong, he got a call, whatever. And what happened, and I thought about it. I said, you know what, I'm a black man, and I go around to stores and stuff, and what if that were me? Was there a difference in this event between Floyd and Perrin? And I can't find a difference. And so I also spoke to a police officer that works for one of our schools, and she says, you know what, Mr. Perrin, listen, I am so fearful for my son, because when I go out on the street and I let my sons go out and do their thing, the officers don't know. And this is a police officer telling me. She's like, the officers don't know who my kid is. They don't know that he's a cut above the rest, because he's a part of the blue. But they don't know that. And she, as an officer, is fearful. So we have to get to a point where we kind of get off all of our status, get off your high horse, get off your low horse, come up, join in with us, let's unify. We're not trying to unify for an individual benefit right now. I'm not trying to benefit just my family, because there are people who refuse to do anything because this is not my family. However, if it was your son, all of a sudden the scenario would completely change. So I just want to encourage everybody, let's take this personal, not in a violent way, but let's take this personal so we all feel personally invested in moving forward into the future, unifying as one. because not only are we George Floyd, we're Arbery, right? Taylor, all of the other names that I can't remember, we are that people. And if we don't unify under one voice and one mind, it will always be easy to separate us, to put us against each other. And if we're fighting each other from the inside, how could we ever fight a battle? How could we fight that battle that we're facing right now?
Yes, thank you. I'm going to let Rudy chime in and respond to this question as well. Again, the question was, what can we do as individuals and as a church in this community to protect our community, our culture, ourselves, and our children?
I think the first thing I want to encourage as ourselves is to do a lot more reading. One book I would definitely recommend is Ibrahim Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, A History of American Racism. And there's a whole host of other books, and so reading is definitely important from an individual basis. And then figure out where do you fit in the lens of strategizing. Are you someone who's a leader? And innovative in ideas? You don't have to be a protester, but maybe you're really good at coding, and maybe there's a need for a new app, right? You don't have to be someone who's amazing at being an app, but maybe you make the most amazing cakes, and some of the activists, when they're meeting, they just are looking for some delicious things to eat. However you can serve, because that's really what the civil rights movement was. I want to echo some of the things that Baba Meadows, and again, Baba, the African aspect of elder in this context, when I referred to him as Baba Meadows, what he was talking about in relation to where is the church right now in relation to the movement. And it should be stated that the church for the civil rights movement was extremely key. But in the Black Lives Matter movement, the church has really kind of just been not a part of that, right? And I'm not talking about merely Adventism, I'm talking about Black churches in general. And I want to pick up also with something else that Meadows had mentioned as well, which is gentrification. The term gentrification came from the British sociologist Ruth Glass. In England, they would use the term gentry, right? And so the gentry will move into areas in which they would move into lower income areas, improve the value of that area, and then those who were from the lower income spectrum end up being priced out of the area. So no matter what race you are, but we find that to happen to a lot of Black and brown people in America. And why do I say that? Because right now, when you had the likes of Dr. King and Reverend Shuttlesworth and the gamut and the like, you end up having Reverend Ike going into the 70s, and then all of a sudden there becomes this thought process in the Black church of the Black prosperity gospel. And in Adventism, that's not really what's celebrated. However, there can be an elitism that exists. And what I find quite often is that middle-class Black people go to church more often, and they go to church in areas that are Black, but they don't live in those communities, right? So really, a part of the face of gentrification in some of these Black areas that haven't been fully gentrified in an economic context are the middle-class Black people representing the gentry and their ideals moving into the church and in the neighborhood, and then leaving church in the neighborhood as soon as church is over. And there's a disconnect between members of the church and members of the community. So to expand that analogy of gentrification between the pulpit and the pews, there's a gentrification aspect barrier between the church and the community at large. And I think now is the time for the church to strategize on how it can empower the Black community, right? Again, it's certain aspects of economic empowerment, which is extremely important. Being a source of educating members of the community of their rights as citizens of America, right? Based upon the 14th Amendment. Being a source in regards to support and understanding and empowering educational tools as well. So whether it be a tutoring center, whether it be funding the local public schools, whether it be having something to empower teachers and maybe give them certain stipends, finding ways to empower the community so that there is not a disconnect. Because when poor Black people are hurting, they're often no longer running to the church because they don't think they can go there. One of the things I want people to think about as well is to echo again what Brother Adrian said earlier. Many of the people who are supposedly quote unquote looting are not a part of the protest. In Miami, I know this for sure. There are people who were arrested from the protest who are not from Miami. In Minneapolis, many of the people who were causing some harms, they were not from Minneapolis. So you have actors who are coming elsewhere. But in those instances where poor Black folk are doing some aspects of looting or are protesting in a certain rage and anger, the question should now be flipped and analyzed. Why do they feel more comfort in burning a building than running to a church? And it's easy to be judgmental and to assume that it's because of their lack of know-how or their decision-making. But I submit to you that the church can do a much better job of being available in the community and not just being there in physical presence. Anytime that we are going to the community as a church, no matter what church this is, and there are churches who are doing amazing things. I applaud Pisgah for its community wing and how it's feeding and empowering people through nourishment. But what I'm simply saying is this: when people only see church members because it's time for a revival, but they don't see them on a regular basis because of a genuine investment in their lives, people are not going to see the church as a refuge. And you cannot make a difference in the lives of people until they see you as a refuge. They must see you as safe to go to and wanting their presence, right? The idea of Jesus allowing himself to be available to people for them to therefore know he wanted them, that they were safe in his presence, allowed and facilitated dialogue and miracles to happen in order for change to occur. But if Jesus did not present first a spirit of refuge, right, then all of a sudden it would not have been effective and people would not have been drawn, right? I cannot stress this enough. Let us not just focus on what Jesus can do, but more so who Jesus is. Because if we're intact and aligned in who Jesus is, then we'll be surprised what Jesus can do.
Thank you, Rudy. And lastly, I want to ask the panelists, how can we have this dialogue with individuals of other races? We can start with Pastor Meadows.
Okay, no problem at all. One of the things that see, this is what you have to understand, and probably I'm telling too much about myself, where as this goes out on the internet, people will use it as a weapon against me. But there was a time, I told you, when I actually believed there was going to be a revolution. And those that did not have a weapon, I thought it was my responsibility to provide one. And it wasn't until I come into the church that I realized, and remember now, some of you don't know, but I came straight from Santeria. I came straight from Yoruba, where 3 demons were assigned to me, Yemaya, Obatala, and Chango, and I came back to Christ. And so when we start talking about people that appear to be of another color, I don't see them as different from me. I see them as extensions from me and me as extensions from them. And the thing that has to be observed, again, I can't but emphasize, is that black is not a color. Black is an experience. You see, and the thing about being black, you have to realize you can be born into it, you can be married into it, by consequences of other actions, you are part of it, but originally, we're all descendants of Adam. So I don't have problem communicating or having that exchange or dialogue. Oftentimes what I have to deal with is their inhibition to communicate with me, because I can be quite in the face. I can quite be, sometimes people say without much regard, but the thing that I'm always confident of is that whatever I say, I'm going to be balanced. And when we speak to people of other race, you have to have a conviction. First of all, you have to have an identity. Because if you don't have an identity, what are you speaking from? And so when we speak about our young people or be concerned about our young people, we need to begin with not only a personal identity, again, because all purpose is derived from God. And before God called you to be saved, before God called you to serve, God called you to be saved. And before God called you to be saved, God called you to a gender. All purpose is derived from God. So what we need to begin to expect, there's a foundation. Now, I do support the option. I'm going down another road, but I'm coming back. I do support the option, the choice of others to make whatever choice they want. But I must have an identity that I don't compromise. And if our young people are not taught to stand where they're standing, you see, this is the question that God asked Adam, where art thou? He's not asking Adam about his geographical location. He was asking Adam, what's your position on this? And Adam said, I'm with the enemy. And so our young people, when they stand before, now this is what I've said, and please take note, that protest, my brother, is preparation for persecution. If we teach our young people how to behave in protest, if we teach our young people how to speak and how to stand under the pressure of protest, when persecution comes, they already had to practice. And so when whatever people it is, by whatever authority, by whatever ethnic background, if our young people are taught to make a stand because they have an identity that they value, then we'll understand that we've done our work. And then lastly, let me say this. There was a little old white lady whose name happened to be white. She said this: the secret of unity is the equality of believers. You want to have a unified body, you want to have a unified movement, you want to have a unified family, you want to have a unified community. The secret of unity is the equality of believers. Somebody send that to Silver Springs.
Thank you. So that wraps up the question aspect of this. Lastly, I want to ask each of our panelists if they could give us 1 minute each of what they would like for our audience to take away from today's discussion. We can start with Andel, and then go over to you, and then we will have Rudy and end with Pastor Meadows, and then Pastor Meadows, after you speak, you can close us out with prayer, please. Thank you.
I think what we can take away from today's discussion is that there are many different ways to participate in what's going on. But the most important thing is to participate. Whether you're protesting, whether you're making your voice heard in that way, whether you're in the courtrooms like someone might, like myself, may be doing, representing the people that may have gotten arrested from protesting, whether you're preaching in the churches, whether you're talking to other people of different cultures, of different experiences that may not see things the way that you see them, it's important to participate. One of the things that Brother Rudy talked about, he talked about what happened in Minneapolis. A decision was made by the city council. How many of us know when our city council meets? How many of us know who sits on our city council?
Good question, good question.
All of these decisions that are being made every day that affect our lives, the 90-odd% of them are happening on the local level. They're happening in our city councils. They're happening in the judges that are elected. They're happening in the prosecutors that are elected. They're happening in the other public officials that are elected, your police chiefs, how these things are funded, how they police your community, who they send to your community. All of these decisions are being made every single day. And it's important for us to stand up and be counted in those places. It's important for us to participate. It's important for us to educate ourselves. And it's important for us to educate others.
Thank you. And Adrielle?
Awesome. If there was one takeaway that I wanted to make sure I leave with everyone, it's the concept of don't sit and wait for your place at the table. I'm going to say that again because I really want to deepen the impression. I'm going to say it again. Don't sit and wait for your place at the table. What do I mean by that? Our community, our African American, our black community has so much power. We actually can speak the language of America. And one of the places that we have not spoken the language of America is in our finances. We have a lot of buying power. And what I'm finding is that kings and queens, our African American, our black kings and queens are not acting like kings and queens. We're sitting down and we're asking. I'm tired of asking. And I think that as a people, we need to establish ourselves. And I look around into the community at our other brothers of other races. I look at our Jewish brothers, and I'm so excited about what they've done, and I'm so encouraged by what they've done. I look at our Hispanic brothers and sisters, and I'm excited about what they've done. And I think that the beauty of God is that He allowed for these differences, not so we could be separate, but so we can represent Him in a different way. And I think that African Americans can come into unity and begin to represent our community in a way where we can be another flower in God's garden. And I think the way that we can do that is, again, by coming together and not simply waiting in America, hoping that the legislation will help us, hoping that, the rules, and hey guys, you didn't follow the rules. I think that our voice is going to come in a totally different way. And I'm all about standing with our brothers and sisters in protest, but it's going to take a little bit more than that to speak the language of America. If we really want our place in the political realm, if we really want to be able to make sure that things are equal for us, we have to start to speak the language. And the only way we'll speak that language is if we start to help us get to a point where we can really be heard in a audible way, but also in a financial, economical way. And that'll begin to change I believe what we want to change.
Thank you. And Rudy, please.
So first, I think it should be stated that more than equality, what I want is equity. Equality is just sameness, right? But the thing I want you to think about is if one group of people have gotten significantly more than another group of people, and then we said, okay, right now we're going to start creating equal shares of power or equal shares of certain things, we still wouldn't be in the literal equal sense, right? Because one group of people have had significantly more than another group of people for hundreds of years. I want equity, right? What is in proportion to what the power should ideally be. I think every black church should study black liberation theology and James Cone. I think that's really important. Every black church should know who James Cone is and black liberation theology. But right now, what I really want to do is affirm the black men that I have the honor of being on this panel with. They all look wonderful and sharp. Dear brother Adrian, man, you are such a light in the community. Thank you for what you've been doing in regards to the protests. Thank you for being an educator and a representation for our black boys, also our black girls, as far as what honor looks like, your creative spirit. I honor you, brother. Dear brother Andel, thank you for being an attorney. Thank you for standing up for justice. Thank you for all those times, brother, where you were brought on as a legal analyst, representing our views, our hearts, our minds. You often spoke for us when we could not speak for ourselves. Baba Meadows, thank you for being an epitome of a black man, a man who is an elder. Thank you for the wisdom that you have sowed into us for years consistently, for being someone who was revolutionary and for being someone who is uplifting and speaks with power. I honor you, black men, and I honor you also because I recognize I'm grateful that you were able to make it home. The only reason why we're able to do this is because we made it home. George Floyd didn't make it home. Laquan McDonald didn't make it home. Ahmaud Arbery didn't make it home. I speak this because the president of my institution where I teach is a black man, He spoke recently in a virtual town hall for our college, and he stated that when he was in college, someone called him an effing N-word. I want you to understand that that is the exact same words that the person who killed Ahmaud Arbery, said to him after he laid there dead. He called him an effing N-word. And if you value these beautiful, wonderful, powerful, brilliant black men, as I affirm them and value them, understand the only reason why they're able to speak right now, the only reason why I'm able to speak right now is because we made it home. Let us continue to press on to make sure more of our black sons and daughters make it home. And lastly, black women, we are nothing without you. You have held us down. You are the ones who have shown the world how much our life matters. We honor you. We affirm you. You are more than just black girl magic. You are the way maker. You are the closest thing to God on this very earth, because you have endured intersectionality. You are both black and you are a woman. You are not in position to be in any kind of proximity to white patriarchy, and so therefore so much has been taken away from you, and yet you go to college more than any other group in America. You are the fastest sector of entrepreneurs, and most of all, you find time to love us black men, and I thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Rudy. And Pastor Meadows?
Yes, and thank you, and I really want to express my appreciation not only for the opportunity to be here, but as well to be asked to pray. In the last 3 or 4 days, I've been invited to pray with different people across this United States and under different circumstances. And to the young people, I want you to know I'm going into prayer right now, and I want you to listen as to how we're preparing ourselves for prayer right now. And that is that you as millennials, I want you to know me, the old man, some say OG. I want you to know I'm pre-OG. There aren't too many brothers inside our belief system who will speak, who will take an interest, and who have a balanced expression or presentation. And I'm not speaking or patting myself on the back. I'm just saying this to you for a reason, and I'm speaking to you X, Y, and Z millennials. I've come to understand as one who appreciates that you are ones that are loyal, you're teachable, you're vulnerable, and you have indiscriminate honesty. I wish I could remember what the girl said in the movie Help. You know, you're wonderful, 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 but I just want you to know that I've come to understand, and I learned and I studied and I put together recently many presentations within the context of how to talk to millennials. You must always say what is true. You must always say what is kind. You must always say what is necessary. And you must always say what is redemptive. I'm saying that to you, you X, Y, and Z people, because I want to buttress that with this. Make sure as you interact with one another, find an OG, find a pre-OG, and balance what is being said, balance what is being discussed, because the strategy is to separate the old from the young. And your vulnerability becomes more pronounced. And then I buttress that with this. Every brother ain't a brother, and every brother ain't black. See, we're going into prayer, and these are the things I want you to understand. Many become few where only few can follow. So however big COVID-19, however large the pandemic, however great your enemy, black or white or indifferent, active or inactive, however large your force, however young you are, remember, God speaks to you where you are in your reasoning capacity. We're in prayer right now because I'm praying that you understand and that you're receiving what I'm saying to you. And you have to understand that no matter how large your problem is, many become few where only few can follow. In other words, how broad the army, how broad the enemy, you can reduce them because many become few where only few can follow. So you are to take your problem to a place where your problem is funneled and it's reduced. For a large army, 1,000 men across, when they go into a valley, must be reduced to a number of 100 or a number of 10 and come through the valley. No matter how large your problem, you can reduce it by taking it through the point of specificity. And these are the words. God's promise is God's presence. And God's presence is God's power. If you want his power, you got to have his presence. If you want his presence, you got to claim the promise. Matthew 21:22. Whatsoever you ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. Our Father and our God, grant us the understanding of the power of promises. Grant us the desire to put forth a strategy to reduce our concerns, our problems, into the valley of specificity. Grant us the eye, the wisdom, the humility to come and sit alongside senior minds and senior hands and senior feet so we can see where they walk and where they have been. Speak to our young hearts and our young minds. We pray, we ask, we plead in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
You don't have to pray long. Just pray good.
Well, that wraps it up for our discussion this evening, and I would like to thank each and every one of our panelists for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us here today. I heard you. I know those that were listening via live heard you, and we appreciate you, and I just hope that you continue to do what you're doing for our community and for all races at that matter. Thank you. Thank you so much. For our listeners and our viewers, we love you, and we hope to see you again.